John, it's 1 p.m. and if you'd like to begin, feel free.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. As you can see from the title slide, this is a webinar featuring the pollution prevention grants and overview of the new emphasis area on pollution prevention and the TSCA chemicals. Just before we get started, I wanted to give a couple of housekeeping notes. First, everyone should know that the webinar will be recorded, and that should be, the recording and transcript should be posted on the web, hopefully in the next week or so. The recording and transcript from the webinar last week, which was an overview of the Pollution Prevention Grant Program, hopefully will be up by early next week. So if you missed that one, you can look at the EPA's Pollution Prevention webpage and find that recording. Also, please note that all of the participants have been muted, but if you have questions, and we encourage you to type your questions into the chat box in the webinar window, and our colleagues in Region 1 will be sorting them. We'll be pausing in the middle of the presentation and then at the end to take any questions or answer any questions that have come in. We'll also, if there are lots of specific questions, we will post those in addition to the webinar. So I just want to give a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour. We'll touch briefly on the P2 grant opportunity, talk a little bit about what is the focus of pollution prevention under the grant opportunity, the overview of all the national emphasis areas, and then dive a little more deeply into the national emphasis area that is focused on business-based P2 solutions for TSCA priorities. My colleague Eileen Sheehan will provide an overview of the amended TSCA and some of the priority chemicals underneath that. And then we will spend a little time drawing the connection between TSCA chemicals and pollution prevention work with some examples and case studies. We'll end it with some guidance for folks who are interested in applying for the pollution prevention grants, and then hopefully have time for questions. I just want to start off, as I said, with an overview of the pollution prevention grant program and the request for proposals, which is now out on the street. The pollution prevention grants were authorized by the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990, and in that, the goal of those are to provide technical assistance and training to businesses about source reduction. And I'll touch more on what that means and what source reduction means. And throughout this presentation, you'll hear the terms source reduction, pollution prevention, and these terms are synonymous. And we'll go into more detail about those in just a bit. The other part of the grants is really to focus on sharing and disseminating best pollution prevention management practices and innovations so that the results and the lessons learned can be shared more broadly than just in a particular program. So that is going to be one of the elements that we'll be looking for in the pollution prevention grant proposals. This is just a quick overview of the eligibility. I'm not going to go through this in any great detail. It's primarily aimed at state entities. That includes state-related colleges and universities. It can also apply to U.S. territories, and including the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and as well as for federally recognized Indian tribes, and tribal consortia. If you have questions about the specifics as to whether your organization is an eligible recipient, I suggest you contact the Regional Pollution Prevention Coordinator. All those contacts are included in the request for proposals, so you can ask them. And I will state one more point on this, is that it is up to the applicant to demonstrate that they are an eligible entity. So if you have some questions, you can talk to the Pollution Prevention Coordinator about how you would demonstrate that. The funding program, we are anticipating giving out about $9.4 million over the next 2 years. That's approximately 4.7 in this current year, with additional funding of about the same next year. However, that is contingent upon Congress providing us those funds. We're expecting that we'll have the funds this year, but we won't know until the budget is passed next year as to the availability of the second round of funding. Individual grants should potentially be in the range of between $40,000 to $500,000 over the 2-year funding period, and that reflects just the federal portion of the grant. I'll talk a little bit. There is a matching requirement for these grants, but the federal portion could be anywhere between $40,000 and $500,000. However, some regions have decided to have lower award caps, so make sure you look in the RFP as to the specific award limits that apply in your area. And we anticipate giving out about 40 to 50 awards over the course of the awarding them this year. And as I mentioned, there is a match requirement under the Pollution Prevention Act. Grant recipients have to provide a dollar-for-dollar match of the total allowable project cost. That means if you are asking for $100,000 of federal funds, you need to provide at least $100,000 in additional funding from, and that can be state funds, it can be funds from other participants, it can also be in-kind match in terms of people's time and other in-kind contributions. And if you have questions about the match and how that's calculated, there's a lot of detail in the RFP on that. And again, you can, I would suggest you contact your regional pollution prevention coordinator if you have questions. I do want to point out that the match requirements are lower for certain groups. For instance, for tribes that have a performance partnership agreement, and this grant would be rolled into that performance partnership agreement, that has a lower match requirement. And the trust territories and possessions of the United States also have a lower match requirement. And all of that information is provided in the RFP. So if you have questions about that, you can look there. I think what is most important for us before we dive into the specifics of the TSCA-related work is to be clear that these grants are really for pollution prevention. They're authorized under the Pollution Prevention Act. And so that defines pollution prevention as source reduction. And I'm just going to highlight some of the key concepts here. This is the words from the Act, but basically reduces the amount of any hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant entering any waste stream or otherwise released into the environment prior to, and this is important, recycling, treatment, or disposal. So source reduction is really getting at pollutant sources at the source before they are generated, and not before, and not after they've been generated through recycling, treatment, or disposal. It's also important to know that pollution source reduction focuses on reducing hazards to public health and the environment associated with the releases or use of those substances, pollutants, or contaminants. In addition to reduction of pollutants or contaminants, you can also include other practices that reduce or eliminate the creation of pollutants through efficiency. That's efficiency in the use of raw materials, energy, water, or other resources. So an example is if you're concerned about air pollutants coming from energy generation, energy efficiency can be a way for reducing the emission of those pollutants. So just to keep that in mind. The other pollution prevention practices are defined down below here, and that includes equipment or technology, process or procedure modifications, redesign of products, substitution of raw materials, improvements. There are all kinds of different activities that can be covered under source reduction. It's also important to point out what is not pollution prevention. We want to make it clear that under this grant program, as I mentioned, practices that alter physical, chemical, or biological characteristics of a pollutant that is, so essentially that is considered treatment or recycling, or after a contaminant or pollutant has been generated, is really not considered source reduction. Recycling of discarded materials, waste, cleanup, disposal activities is also not considered pollution prevention. You can have ancillary amounts of this kind of work within these grants, but if the focus is more on treatment or recycling or disposal is a major part of the work conducted, it will not be considered eligible for a pollution prevention grant award. The national emphasis areas, the RFP and the National Pollution Prevention Program in general has 3 focus areas, what we call national emphasis areas, or NEAs. And those are listed here. As you see, we'll talk more in greater detail about the first one, but just so you know that the other 2 are focused on food and beverage manufacturing and processing, and that can include all aspects of source reduction opportunities in those sectors, whether it's energy, water, toxics reduction, those kind of aspects. And then the third is NEA is state and community approaches to reduce hazardous materials, and that is really to focus on innovative approaches to reach businesses on toxics use reduction, hazardous materials reduction, or other pollution prevention opportunities that are really focused on specific communities. The one thing I also wanted to make sure I emphasize, and if I didn't touch on it before, is the pollution prevention grant programs is really focused on promoting source reduction and pollution prevention to businesses. That's in the Pollution Prevention Act. And so proposals need to demonstrate how they are reaching some portion of the business community. And so while we recognize that there are opportunities for reducing or implementing source reduction for municipalities and local governments and state governments, the focus of this grant program is on business assistance. So with that, I want to dive a little deeper into the first NEA, as that is really the subject of our webinar today. This is a new emphasis area, and it's building on EPA's increased focus on the revitalization of the TSCA program under the revised TSCA statute that was passed, I guess, 2 years ago. And Eileen Sheehan from our office will provide greater detail about that in just a moment. The NEA has 3 main pieces to it, and this comes straight out of the RFP. Basically, the goal of it is to carry out technical assistance and source reduction projects that test, implement, or disseminate business-based P2 solutions for the TSCA-regulated chemicals. Now, that's a very broad universe, and the next slide will include a link to the full list of TSCA-regulated chemicals. But even within that, we will provide emphasis on chemicals that have been identified in the TSCA 2014 work plan for chemical assessment. And these are chemicals, it's a list of chemicals that EPA has identified as candidates for assessment based on a variety of factors, including their potential for concern to children's health, neurotoxicity, whether they are persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic, probable or known carcinogens, or detected in biomonitoring programs. So these are a set of chemicals that have have been identified and as probably good candidates for further assessment. And then Eileen will also touch on, there's a shorter list of about 10 chemicals that are, for which there's more immediate action, that are a subset that projects could focus on, but are not, those aren't required to be focused on. The third bullet outlines really the kind of work we are expecting under this grant NEA. We're asking projects, or looking for projects that will encourage businesses to identify and adopt chemical and process alternatives, promote innovative efforts on market-driven research, product design, or product substitution, things that target source reduction, that is, reducing the use or release of hazardous substance, pollutants, or contaminants. So the TSCA regulated chemicals is a broad list, and it provides a lot of opportunities, and applicants need to draw a nexus between why they feel like the chemicals or sectors that they're focusing on has some relevance for reducing the use of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. Here are the list of the two chemical lists that I just mentioned, and these links are available. The handout, I think, is available for download if you look in the webinar box. The first is for the full list of chemicals regulated under TSCA, and the second is the work plan chemicals that I mentioned. With that, I'll turn it over to Eileen Sheehan to give an overview of the revised TSCA and some additional chemical-specific information. Just as introduction, Eileen Sheehan has been a pollution prevention coordinator and administered these grants. She's been a manager in the Regional Pollution Prevention Program here in Region 9, and for the last several years has been working with the national TSCA program as they work to implement the revisions to the TSCA program. So she is an expert on all things on both sides of this issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eileen.
Thank you, John, and it's great to join all of you today. I wanted to just mention, for anyone who is not familiar with TSCA, it stands for the Toxic Substances Control Act. And the slide that's up now on the webinar, it gives you a high-level overview of just one part of TSCA that was amended in June 2016. They amended TSCA with what was called the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. So this gives you the overview of one part of how TSCA regulates existing chemicals. I won't be addressing other provisions of amended TSCA, such as new chemicals or petitions or preemption. The three key steps are shown in blue. They are prioritization of chemicals, evaluation of chemicals, and then the risk management decisions and actions. And under step one, prioritization, EPA will be designating chemicals high priority or low priority for risk evaluation, drawing on available data, drawing on trends in toxic release inventory reporting or chemical data reporting. They will also look at volumes, manufactured, and use. In step two, risk evaluation, EPA will develop a scope to address the hazards, exposures, conditions of use, and potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, basically evaluating a specific chemical in that light. And the result of the risk evaluation is a determination. And you see those two boxes coming off. The determination will be either the chemical poses an unreasonable risk or it poses no unreasonable risk. And under step three, the risk management step, that's where EPA will consider a range of actions, everything from restrictions and prohibitions on the chemical to pollution prevention opportunities that might eliminate the hazard. And in step three, among other considerations, EPA will be considering alternatives. So what are the pollution prevention opportunities throughout this three-step process? And there are a number of opportunities for pollution prevention providers to kind of weigh, and the P2 community to weigh in. However, and I really want to underscore this point, not all of the opportunities or that I'll identify now are fundable under the P2 grants. But since all of you are, on the webinar, I think it's important to let you know other ways you can weigh in to influence and shape TSCA. So here are some ways the P2 community can contribute to or feed into TSCA. In step 1, states, tribes, technical assistance programs, and P2 practitioners may have chemical, environmental, or use data that they can contribute to EPA setting priorities as to which chemicals to address first. Some of you may know about emerging chemicals. Also, P2 practitioners understand well how businesses and others use these chemicals. If you're interested in more information on this, you can see the prioritization guidance that EPA has recently issued on how they're going to prioritize chemicals. In the second step, risk evaluation, again, states and tribes and other P2 practitioners can weigh in with information on those chemical uses, again, and on exposure scenarios. I cannot underscore enough how important it is that your experience and insights are valuable. Some prior P2 grants that address specific chemicals that are currently being evaluated, those are already, those P2 grant reports are already being cited and considered in the risk evaluations. So there's definitely ample opportunity here. Finally, in step 3, risk management, the P2 community undoubtedly has some input on the range of options for managing the risk, but also on the alternatives that are under consideration. So I know TAPS, many technical assistance programs have existing connections and well-established relationships with affected business sectors and industries, and those can inform this risk management process. I do want to underscore that this is a two-way street. Not only can you contribute to TSCA, this process is also generating a lot of data from other stakeholders, and EPA is pulling data together on the chemicals that I think could be useful to P2 practitioners. It gives you greater access to chemical information and chemical uses. You can look at the scoping documents on the first 10 chemicals or the PBT, persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals that I'm about to show you, and that may spark ideas among the P2 practitioners. So next slide. This next slide shows the first 10 chemicals that EPA is already working on, along with the 5 PBT chemicals. We're highlighting these chemicals not because they are a higher priority for grant funding, but because EPA has produced some information on these chemicals. And I just want to, they're currently targets of effort. So it's important to be aware of what's underway now. The first 10 include a lot of familiar chemicals to many of you. There are solvents such as TCE, PERC, methylene chloride, among others. There's a flame retardant, HBCD. And I think one thing I just want to caveat with these first 10, you see others that of course you're familiar with, but I want to just note that the amended TSCA does have a slightly different process for these first 10 chemicals, and indeed for the PBT chemicals as well. And that's because the time frame was very compressed between when TSCA was enacted in June of 2016 and when documents and analyses were to be completed. So the 5 PBT chemicals, which you see here, decabrominated diphenyl ether, HCBD, and I'm not even going to go through the others, but these are being addressed under TSCA Section 6, which required EPA to take expedited regulatory action without a risk evaluation. So the process flowchart from the previous slide that showed risk evaluation, there will not be a risk evaluation for these 5 PBT chemicals because they were already assessed previously. So they're moving on a slightly faster track. This next slide just shows you 3 of these first 10 chemicals. And John, if you can move to that next slide. Thank you. So here you see TCE, methylene chloride, perc. They're all solvents. And I think it's fair to say that pollution prevention TAPs and practitioners have likely encountered these chemicals before. And I'm highlighting them because I really just want to be sure that you can see some of the sectors, and these are only examples. TCE is used by dry cleaners as a spot cleaner. It's used in vapor degreasing, metal finishers use it, hobbyists use it, and consumers use it. So I just wanted to highlight the type of sectors and some examples of uses for all of the first 10 chemicals. We hope that this slide and the next 2 slides on the other chemicals just helps you connect the TSCA chemical work with the on-the-ground business work, that business assistance pollution prevention work that all of you are engaged in. So I do want to just, I think we can just look through the others. There's 1-bromopropane or N-propyl bromide, asbestos, HBCD, the flame retardant. And then the next slide, I think, shows some perhaps lesser known, at least one of them is lesser known chemicals. If you're able to move to that next slide, the 1,4-dioxane, oh, I think carbon tet is actually quite well known, and N-methylpyrrolidone as well. But then the last 2 are 1,4-dioxane and pigment violet 29. So I think it's important we understand that the hazardous materials reduction, source reduction work is one part of what P2 practitioners do. You work on the broad range of P2 that John highlighted earlier: water conservation, energy efficiency. And the hazardous material source reduction piece is just one part. But for the TSCA national emphasis area, the connection between chemicals and hazardous material reduction is fundamental. So I'm not going to, that's it for these, just trying to highlight for you the first 10 chemicals, mentioning the 5 PBT chemicals, and then giving you examples of sectors and uses. The 3 key takeaways, though, for this section on TSCA is that amended TSCA and the TSCA national emphasis area, it does dovetail with the expertise and work undertaken by folks in the P2 community over the years. Secondly, there is an opportunity for P2 practitioners to inform the process under TSCA, contributing knowledge on how chemicals are used on the ground in businesses and your knowledge of alternatives as well. But the final point is the TSCA national emphasis area gives prospective grantees, all of you, a chance to fund some of the work that you do with businesses and sectors on hazardous materials reductions. With that, I think we may be pausing for some questions on John's piece of the presentation and then the TSCA piece.
Well, since we're fresh on TSCA, Eileen, I have 2 questions related to TSCA. So why don't we do those, and then I can circle back to the broader grant questions. The first one is, where can you find a complete list of TSCA-regulated chemicals which can be targeted for a project?
Okay, so there is what's known as the TSCA inventory thousands of chemicals. And we can send out a link to the TSCA inventory. But for the most part, many of the early priority chemicals that will be identified under TSCA, including the 10 and the 5 that I just showed you, they're under the 2014 work plan document. And John's slide number, actually I may not have the right slide number, they are listed in the back of the document that John, he had a link to the TSCA 24, slide 10. Thank you.
And that's available as a download on, if you look on the webinar panel.
And I would encourage you to look at those. I think it's 90 chemicals, but it includes some of the ones we just mentioned. And there may be other emerging chemicals that you're seeing that are presenting problems in your, in your waterways or elsewhere that you might want to focus on. So I wouldn't limit yourself strictly to those 90 work plan chemicals, but that's a good start to prompt your thinking.
Thanks, Eileen. Olaf asks, with the administrator's war on lead, is the TSCA lead-based paint program covered in this NEA?
Most of the work, and John, perhaps you can pitch in here too, and Mary, much of the work on lead is not, it's not focused on reducing at the source. I thought most of the lead work is focused on cleanup and abatement, which is not as, I think, doesn't fall as strongly in the definition of P2, but I'd like to hear what John or others would say.
I would agree with you, Eileen. Because the lead is already out there in the environment, namely in lead dust, then it is not pollution prevention or source reduction. It's actually pollution control work. So it would not be under the definition of P2 and therefore ineligible under this RFP. So those are the only 2 TSCA questions, and we may get more, but for now, I'm going to circle back. The only other question is actually a multi-layered question, and Michelle and John and Eileen, maybe between the 3 of you, you can help with these. So Georgia has a multi-layered question. Do we need to have memorandums of agreement with businesses and schools in place before we apply for our grant?
I can answer that. It depends on what role they'll be playing in the project. If they are providing some sort of match that is in kind or staff or funding to match it, then I would strongly encourage you to have some letter that demonstrates how they will provide that match and how much it will be and how that's being calculated, whether it's person hours or actual dollars or contractor time or whatever. If they're just going to be groups that you're going to reach out to, and it wouldn't hurt to have documentation that they're interested in working with you. That certainly strengthens your proposal, but it's not required. But if they are going to be counted towards the match requirement, then yes, I would strongly encourage you to have a letter of commitment on what that match is. Michelle,
Thanks,
anything else to add?
No, John, I think that was nicely covered.
Great. Can we use a portion of the funds to pay an employee or contractor to execute the grant? We are short-staffed.
I believe so. I mean, I'm not sure about the contractor, but if it's going through a state entity, you have a negotiated overhead rate that should cover that. But if you need to pay or hire a new staff person or pay a contractor to be the grant manager, that just can't be a significant portion of the grant. I mean, it can fall under the portion that is for grant administration.
Could I just add to that? So it's very common to hire someone to come in and do significant work on a grant project. However, I just wanted to say that for the grant application, you're going to have to provide some evidence of the key people that will be working on the project. And if you have yet to hire that person, there are places, where you're going to be scored, and if you are not providing adequate justification and information related to the key contacts that will be working on the project, you may not get as many points for that once your application is being evaluated. But it is an eligible cost, correct, Michelle?
Yes, that's correct.
Here's another part of that question. Can we apply for multiple small projects rather than one large one?
That's a strategy question. If you apply for multiple different grants, they get evaluated individually, and so they will rise and fall based on their own merits. If you bundle them all together in one larger grant, they will be evaluated all together as just one grant, and so you have to decide from your perspective, which is going to make your application the most competitive. The one thing I will note is that if EPA has the right to provide or offer partial funding for grants, which is if you apply for 150,000 and we only have 100,000 available, and the best way for us to be able to offer partial funding is if each element of the grant is very clearly, each specific task is clearly costed out, and so it's separable. So if we can say, we'll pay for, the research and the technical assistance, but we won't pay for the webinars because we don't have enough money for that piece of it, and we know that the first two were 100,000 and the third one was 50,000, so we're not going to pay for that piece. So that's one thing to think about if you're looking at a number of different activities, is if you put them into one grant, make it very clear how they are separable, and you're more likely to get, or you're going to be more eligible for partial funding if we get to that point, than if you just lump it all together in one big dollar amount and we can't figure out how each task is being paid for.
Thanks, John. I think maybe we can probably head back into the presentation and continue through to the end, and then break for more questions then.
Yep. So I just want to make sure that, and the next part of this, Eileen, thank you, provided a great overview of both some of the chemicals that are of EPA's focus, and also how you can use the TSCA program and the work that's going on there to help inform your activities, as well as help us inform our activities. But in terms of the grant program, I want to point your attention to there's an appendix to the request for proposals that gives examples for each of the national emphasis areas on the kinds of activities that we are hoping to fund or that might be eligible. And I just want to make it very clear that these are just examples. They don't represent the full range of ideas or opportunities out there, but it's really just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that could be funded. And I'm not going to go through all of this. This slide has a lot of words, but what I want to highlight are the kinds of activities that should be very familiar to pollution prevention programs who have applied for these grants in the past, and also I think we'll give some ideas for those who may not have worked on these grants in the past. The first thing is, clearly providing technical assistance to businesses to identify or pilot alternatives or options for existing chemicals. A lot of pollution prevention programs across the country provide technical assistance that's written into the Pollution Prevention Act. And really what we're talking about here is an opportunity to focus, if not on other things like energy or water conservation or hazardous waste reduction, but to focus on specific chemicals that are TSCA priorities. So clearly technical assistance to businesses and pilot projects to demonstrate innovative approaches are welcome. We also encourage industry collaborations or projects, either to develop or test alternative chemicals or processes to reduce hazards associated with priority chemicals, or those things that explore uses and applicability of innovative chemicals. EPA provides some guidance on where safer chemicals can be used both in our new chemicals program as well as through the Safer Choice program. We also have guidelines for eco-labels and standards and that are used in federal procurement. So these kind of industry collaborations are really valuable, bringing affected industries together or who have some common uses and using their collective wisdom to both identify better processes or practices. And I want to make this very clear, industry collaborations on their own, just having a meeting of industry folks is not enough. They really need to be oriented towards action in some way. So that includes, making sure that, does that mean that businesses are helping each other or those kind of, or that the solutions that are brainstormed among the groups are somehow brought out to the larger community. Another set of activities that we would consider funding are conducting outreach with large institutional procurement officials, and that is focused on environmentally preferable and safer choice products. Safer Choice is an EPA label program for chemical-intensive products. We also, as I said, have guidance that we use for federal purchasers that others can use on accepted eco-labels and standards for safer products or environmentally preferable products, and you can reference those. And another area is working with industries impacted by chemical regulation or restrictions to develop public-private partnerships. Again, this is an area where many pollution prevention programs or even university outreach programs that have an applied science bias, they've done this, where they've worked with public and private partnerships on specific issues, and we consider orienting those towards the TSCA chemicals. Just want to give some examples of these specific areas that we have funded in the past through the pollution prevention grants. For example, under demonstration projects or research, our region, Region 9, has funded pollution prevention grants that evaluated and demonstrated alternatives to chlorinated and high VOC solvents in a number of different sectors, including auto repair, printing, metal finishing, adhesives, and dry cleaning. And these were very much hands-on practical projects where the grantee went into shops, identified what chemicals they were using, used existing information from regulatory agencies, from air and water regulatory agencies to know where those chemicals were coming from and why they were a hazard, and then went into the shops and said, what can you use? Where can we find safer processes or different practices or alternatives that are safer and or have lower hazard? And they demonstrated that how those would work in those different industries, what were the transition costs, what were some of the different implementation issues that had to be overcome, and then was able to provide both technical assistance to additional businesses, trainings, workshops, materials like fact sheets and reports that then could be used to disseminate those findings more broadly. So that's the kind of work that we would see under the demonstration project or research. Another example, many of the existing pollution prevention grant recipients provide technical assistance, and I'm just pointing out 3 examples here where that technical assistance has been targeted to chemically intensive processes or sectors. For instance, in Region 10, which is the Pacific Northwest, the Pollution Prevention Resource Center provided technical assistance for auto body and repair shops, and they focused on solvents like methylene chloride and mineral spirits and toluene and others that are used in those sectors. In Region 5, which is the Upper Midwest, the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program had a whole initiative focused on alternatives for paint stripping. to reduce hazardous waste and hazardous material use in that industry. And in Region 1, that's the New England region, the University of Massachusetts, the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, TURI, they have a whole program focused on alternatives to perchloroethylene in professional cleaning and helping cleaners transition to wet cleaning, which uses just detergents and water in lieu of solvents. And they have a significant outreach effort to help businesses make that transition. So these are just some examples of how technical assistance can address priority chemicals under the TSCA program. And finally, we have some examples where pollution prevention programs have convened roundtables of industries to try and address toxics of concern. For instance, in Region 7, which is the central part of the country, they held a roundtable focused on trichloroethylene in the aerospace industry. And the goal of that was both to share best practices, understand among the industry businesses that are in that area, where are they using it, why are they using it, what are some of the barriers to finding safer alternatives, and then moving towards action on some of those barriers. In Region 2, our pollution prevention grants this is the New York and New Jersey area. They focus on, they have an established Western New York Sustainable Business Roundtable. It hasn't been focused specifically on TSCA chemicals, but it could. It's an existing roundtable that if they were able to identify some chemicals of concern, there's an infrastructure there to provide business-to-business peer assistance. And this last one is, it's not a project that has been funded by an EPA grant, but it's an interesting opportunity or an interesting example that others might consider. In California, the state passed regulations that allowed for the labeling of furniture for those that have chemical flame retardants versus those that don't, to meet the state flammability requirements. And what San Francisco did is they brought together furniture retailers in the city, and then actually they spread it even further than just the city, to talk about how they can both identify furniture that does not have toxic flame retardants in them, and then also to educate their customers as well as their suppliers on what their preferences would be. So it's a slightly different example of a roundtable, but has a very clear nexus to finding ways to promote toxic chemical reduction. And these are just, as I said, these are just examples. There are a number of other kinds of programs that the Pollution Prevention Grant have funded. For instance, we have funded interns, engineering and environmental science interns in several different states to go into businesses and provide on-site technical assistance, being embedded in a company for a while to identify opportunities. And those kind of programs are great, and they could just as easily, I think, be oriented towards chemical related issues. So you could get chemical engineering students to help identify where are there, or toxicology students or public health students to go into companies and figure out where are they using hazardous chemicals that may pose some regulatory risk for the company, and find alternatives for them. We also have programs that are fund programs that provide incentives to businesses through recognition, like state leadership programs, where they recognize companies who have taken innovative action to reduce, to promote source reduction. And often that's in areas like energy efficiency or water efficiency, but those same sort of leadership programs could focus on chemical use reduction or hazard reduction just as easily. So there are a number of existing programs that we funded that could take a TSCA focus, and we'd be interested in seeing examples of those as well. We just want to end with some guidance for potential applicants as you get into the proposal development phase. First thing is, there's lots of resources out there to characterize the issues and the audiences that you want to target. And I would really encourage anyone who's considering applying for a grant to spend some time doing this. It's not like we expect that you will know every single use and every single business that's using a chemical or where a chemical is being used. Some projects, part of their time is to figure out exactly how a particular pollutant or hazard or issue is being addressed out there in the world. But there is information on in the TSCA documents that give you a good idea of where some of these priority chemicals are being used. That's in the scoping documents that are listed here, as well as there was a set of use documents that fed into the scoping documents where it's really a great data set to identify what industries are likely to be using some of these chemicals. You can also look at EPCRA, that's the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Tier 2 data, and this is data that businesses have to provide either to local governments or to the states on where they are using or storing hazardous chemicals, and it's primarily for emergency planning. And that data is available in differing places, but if you can tap into that, you'll have a good sense of who is using what chemicals and where. Certain states like New Jersey and Massachusetts have state chemical reporting requirements where industries have to report not just on what they emit, like through the toxic release inventory, but also on what they are using or importing. So those are opportunities. Some states also, such as Maine and Washington and Oregon, have information on chemical uses in specific kinds of products, like children's products, and people using chemicals in specific products have to report that. So that's another area. And we just, in general, we encourage you to focus on uses or sectors or chemicals that are priorities for your state or region. And the last piece of advice I would give is really to make sure that your application is really oriented towards action. It's okay to, and by that I mean that you're focused on providing assistance to businesses to actually make changes that will address the issues or priorities or chemicals or hazards that you identified up above. It's not enough to just do research to say, where are these being used? You have to figure out, well, what are we going to do to get people to move to a different end state? And that's the same can be said for things like industry roundtables, where it's not enough to just bring people together to talk about solutions. There needs to be some indication of how you're going to take that input and that feedback and turn it into action by your target audience. And with that, I would point you to the pollution prevention centers. There are 8 of them around the country. There are a wealth of information on existing activities and projects and past case studies and those kind of things. And don't be afraid to replicate existing strategies. Part of the goal of the Pollution Prevention Act is to make sure that best practices are taken out and spread more broadly. So to the extent that you're seeing good things that were done in a particular project in a particular locality, is there a way you can take that and spread that in your area? And with that, I just want to end on just the last 2 resources. There's the Pollution Prevention Grants page, which gives you all the information on the RFP and guidance. And then questions on the RFP can direct it to the agency's contact, which is listed in the request for proposals. So with that, we have about 7 minutes left, and I hope there are some questions.
John, if you could go back to slide 18, there's a question specifically about a potential cost, and it relates to the second to last bullet. So the question that Georgia asks is, could we use funding to purchase equipment for source reduction and give that to a business, or would that business need to cost share for the equipment? And the example that's used here is, what if they purchased low flow toilets and shower heads for the tourism industry in that state?
You can use that. There is a whole set of requirements in the grants that if you buy equipment that you have to basically account for that. If you use federal money to buy equipment, you have to account for that afterwards. Things like shower heads are probably not, something that has a value after 5 years. And I guess what I would say from our experience in the past is that can be a piece of it, but more on a demonstration level. I don't know to what extent how much of the budget you're thinking about would be for equipment. The businesses do not have to have a cost share, but you do have to have a cost share for the program overall. So to the extent that you're giving away the shower heads, there's no requirement that the businesses have to pay for part of that.
So John or Michelle, you may be able to help with this question from Jennifer. In the past, we were approved to use part of grant funding to go to sub-grantees through an existing state P2 grant structure. We would like to know if we can still pass through any of the money as seed grants for implementing P2 opportunities identified.
I just went through grant training and heard from the our EPA grant specialists that yes, you can do sub-grants and sub-awardees. And the only thing would be that you would have to, in the RFP, either indicate who those are if you know them. If it's going to be some kind of a competitive process to give sub-awards or to grantees, you need to outline how you're going to go about doing that. What's the process by which you will be picking people to get sub-awards? So you can't just pick your friends and give it out. That violates federal requirements on competitive bidding. But if they're going out as grants under the state rules for that, that's fine. You just have to describe how you're going to go about doing it.
Thanks, John. Connor asks, will a grant proposal be less competitive if it focuses on an emerging chemical of concern that is not currently listed under TSCA? And I think this gets to whether or not you would do that project under NEA 1 or NEA 3, John, right?
Yeah, I think you could probably list it both. It would be surprising to me that it's not on the TSCA inventory. If it's not in the work plan chemical realm, I think, in the past, before we had this NEA, we still asked folks to make a clear justification as to, why do they think that's an issue? And in some cases, we've had it where it's an emerging pollutant or it's something that hadn't been studied a lot or was suddenly being used as a replacement for something that was heavily regulated, and they were replacing the regulated chemical with something that had not been well characterized. So if you can provide a good justification as to why it's important from an environmental hazard, human health hazard, or some other reason, that should be okay. And
so
you may want to do that under the third NEA as well. Sorry, Mary.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I just wanted to follow up. Just thinking that the subtlety here, though, is if you're thinking about an emerging chemical, it needs to be source reduction. So if, for example, I don't know what pollutant or what chemical you're thinking of, but PFAS and PFOA are actually emerging chemicals of concern, but they're already out there in the environment, and many projects related to how to deal with that would be pollution control and not source reduction. So it depends on the chemical, and it depends on whether or not you're specifically focusing in on source reduction. If it's not on the TSCA list and you are still thinking, I want to reduce the pollution at its source, then you can go under NEA 3, which is the larger hazards reduction NEA, rather than NEA 1, which is TSCA specifically related.
This is Eileen. The perfluorinated are definitely on the TSCA inventory.
Great. So there is a question that asks us to identify some examples of acceptable results metrics for roundtable and leadership programs. And I think I would like to start to respond to that by saying the roundtable should be a means to an end and should be a way for people to communicate across the sector regarding, economic impacts. Should particular chemicals be restricted or banned in the future. But also there should be, the conversation needs to go beyond just pulling people together to dialogue. Really, there needs to be either some commitment to either be willing to pilot alternatives or present a means to communicate among sectors regarding changes in regulations for uses of those particular contaminants. John, Eileen, Michelle, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I guess examples of, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Examples of results that come from roundtables or leadership programs.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Mary said. Examples, for instance, if a leadership program recognizes businesses that have reduced particular toxics, some of the results would be how many businesses applied, what were the reductions. I mean, and you'd be asking those who apply, tell us what your results were. You don't just get credit for saying you did good things. Can you actually demonstrate it in terms of numbers? And again, I would suggest that leadership program would have to be focused on source reduction, though. So it's not like, oh, well, we figured out how to recycle, 2/3 of our solvents by sending it off somewhere to be recycled. That doesn't count as source reduction.
Thanks, John and Eileen and Michelle. I think we've teed up all of the questions or answered them behind the scenes if they were sort of repetitive. I don't have any new questions that have been typed in, so I think we can conclude.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mary. And I didn't introduce Michelle Amhaz, who's the headquarters lead on the pollution prevention grant program, and she was instrumental in getting this all together. So thank you, Michelle.